Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and healing from these relationships. Let's talk attachment styles. More and more people are exploring their attachment styles, and these attachment styles, which develop in childhood, can have implications for adult relationships. And your attachment style has bearing on how things may unfold, in particular in a narcissistic relationship. In this series, we will be taking on the 4 attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure, and talk about how these may show up in a narcissistic relationship. Now remember, this stuff about attachment styles, it's not a horoscope, right? You aren't stuck forever being an ambitious Capricorn. Healthy connections as your life goes on can shape your way of being in the world and your attachment. Research has also shown that our mental health in a present moment is a stronger predictor than other factors such as childhood attachment style for determining certain aspects of relationship health. Basically, how you're doing now is more important than the stuff that might have happened in the past. And even within a family, you may have a very secure attachment with one parent and an insecure attachment style with another. One of those attachment styles may predominate, especially if that secure attachment was with the more present parent, and you still may go on to secure attachments in adulthood. None of this is dooming you, okay? But let's start at the top with the anxious attachment style. People with anxious attachment styles are folks that can feel insecure and pretty much on their back foot in close relationships. There is an asymmetry when an anxiously attached person enters any relationship, but definitely in a narcissistic relationship, because the anxiously attached person will devalue or undervalue themselves and overvalue the narcissistic person. And since the narcissistic person is already devaluing the anxiously attached person, that's a lot of devaluing for that person. In relationships, people who are anxiously attached often seek a lot of reassurance. They wait for the approval and for the validation of the other person. Again, this is a terrible position to be in a narcissistic relationship, since that validation faucet is only running one way and it isn't towards you. And because anxiously attached people often do need reassurance to feel not only safe, but to stave off that fear of abandonment, narcissistic relationships can be brutal for people with this attachment style. This need for reassurance may extend, for example, to seeking out reassurance when you are separated from them. Like, for example, one of you is going on a trip and one of you is not. And first of all, let's face it, narcissistic people tend to have a propensity for poor boundaries and may be shady, especially when they're away. So all of this, just the very act of separation and the shadiness on top of that, can make separations and distance really difficult for anxiously attached people who not only find separations to be devastating, then they really, really, really miss the person. Now here is where it gets even more difficult. Many narcissistic people, especially vulnerable narcissistic people, also have anxiously attached styles. So that means that the vulnerable narcissistic person may be grappling for reassurance and approval and validation, but have little to offer and return. And the valuation dynamic will get overpowered. The narcissism may overpower the attachment style, and what we may see is that the vulnerable, anxiously attached narcissistic person is sort of feeling like a victim, but also undervaluing the other person, but also living in fear of being abandoned by the other person. So you can see how these relationships can get so twisted and contentious. Anxiously attached styles are come out of a combination of high anxiety but low avoidance. This is an attachment style that's also called the preoccupied attachment style, meaning that there's anxiety and fear around attachment and separation and lots of rumination about these relationships. The anxiously attached person is often thinking about the other person in the relationship when they're not with them. And yet, anxiously attached people do rather regularly find themselves in relationships with narcissistic people. Who knows, maybe because these relationships resembled at least one early childhood relationship in which attachment seeking was insecure at best. Now, anxious attachments again, are come out of early relationships characterized by inconsistency, caregiver unavailability, just sort of caregivers that are in and out. Parents that create anxious attachments create environments that are actually quite similar to narcissistic relationships, attuned at some times, misattuned at many others, and the child is left anxious and not safe in the assurance that they can beckon and call forth the caregiver when they need them. And the other narcissistic vibe that creates these anxious attachments is that parents that foster anxious attachments are those who look to the child for their own needs, for the parent's need to be validated. These are parents who may be intrusive and in terms of have really lousy boundaries, and the child simply becomes a source of narcissistic supply. These parents may overparent when they believe it's going to get them the validation or the result that they want. It's not unusual for anxiously attached children to come from families where the children are only interesting when they make the parents look good. And in this way, we can see how the intergenerational cycles of narcissistic parenting can foster anxious attachments that may create all kinds of relationship challenges for the next generation. The devaluation that anxiously attached people sort of push towards themselves is what makes this style most treacherous in narcissistic relationships, because people with this style are already so self-disparaging that when the narcissistic person participates in the devaluation, the anxiously attached person may become reinforced in the sense that it is true, and the fears of separation and abandonment may mean that the person will fall into deeply entrenched trauma-bonded cycles of justification and rationalization and self-blame. This group of anxiously attached folks suffer quite a bit in narcissistic relationships. And for anxiously attached folks, having consistent, loving, and accessible supports in adulthood is crucial. Basically, the opposite of a narcissistic relationship. So for those of you out there who have taken the tests and found out that you have an anxious attachment style and you've had a narcissistic relationship, you know it was a wild ride and frankly a very unhealthy one. This is a particularly bad style in terms of the harm it brings to the person, the anxiously attached person in these relationships, because the very dynamics are all being constantly played on, creating greater and greater sense of fear and anxiety in these relationships. So I hope that clears that up, and thanks again.